So picture this. A master yogi is meditating for like 12 hours a day in total silence.
Right.
He's chasing the ultimate state of human enlightenment, putting himself through just grueling physical discipline. And he gets absolutely nothing.
Wow, nothing at all.
Nothing. But then, a week later, he's standing in the middle of a totally standard, noisy Sunday church service, and he spontaneously collapses into the highest state of consciousness known to ancient science.
It's wild because it completely shatters that cinematic, highly stylized image we have of spiritual evolution, doesn't it?
Oh, completely.
We're so conditioned to believe that these peak human experiences require, isolation. Like you have to be alone on a mountaintop enduring extreme physical hardship.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is why today's deep dive is just so fascinating. We are pulling apart this massive kind of paradoxical question.
Right.
Why does the medical and spiritual data suggest that joining a church choir or, even volunteering at a soup kitchen, why might that actually be a more effective biological hack for reaching enlightenment than a lifetime on a meditation cushion?
It really forces us to look at the actual mechanics of human consciousness rather than just the aesthetic of spirituality.
Right, the aesthetic. And our guide for this, the source material we're diving into today, is incredibly unique. We're looking at the teachings of Osman.
Yeah, he's known widely across YouTube and Spotify as the Blind Muslim Yogi.
Yes, and just for some context on who we are dealing with here, he is a master-level bioenergy healer. He's practiced advanced yoga and meditation for 50 years.
50 years? That's incredible.
Yeah, and often for up to 18 hours a day in his earlier stages. He actually achieved his first state of samadhi, which we will definitely define later, when he was just 19 years old.
His background is remarkably dense. He specializes in critical care, recovery, terminal illnesses, and he claims an exceptionally high success rate in his private practice.
But it's crucial to understand his framework, right?
Exactly. He operates on quantum and entanglement principles, which essentially means he's focused on how natural energy systems in the body can be manipulated or transferred.
Right, and he is very upfront about this. He states that his 90% success rate isn't some, inexplicable magic trick.
No, not at all.
It's actually entirely normal if you understand human biology.
Yeah.
His argument is that modern lifestyles completely deplete our natural energies, which leads to severe ailments, even cancer.
Yeah, he says if you follow his protocols, your natural energy just improves, which naturally boosts your immunity by 90%.
So he is essentially just restoring the baseline that modern stress destroyed.
And that biological baseline is going to be a massive theme for us today.
Definitely. Now, before we go any further, there is an incredibly poignant detail about Osman. He has been permanently blind since May of 2023.
Right.
So if you dive into his content, like his free YouTube channel where he gives away all his core techniques or his paid Patreon for one-on-one sessions, you might hear him describe vivid visual details.
And that's because he had normal eyesight for decades before losing it recently. It adds an incredibly powerful layer to his teachings on internal vision, and psychological resilience.
Absolutely. And speaking of his teachings, his stated mission is to revive ancient, complex scientific methods by simplifying them for the modern world.
He's very passionate about that.
He is. You can actually go to his website right now, yogawellness786.com, and download a totally free 5-minute yoga and meditation program.
And he's adamant about how these tools should be used.
Right. He says his methods, while highly effective, are complementary. They enhance medical care. They absolutely do not replace it.
Yeah, if you have a serious medical condition, you keep taking your prescriptions. You listen to your licensed doctor.
Exactly. You just use these ancient scientific protocols to support that journey.
Establishing that boundary is so vital. It moves the conversation completely away from mystical alternative medicine and grounds it in supplementary biological science.
Okay, so let's get into the meat of his argument.
Yeah.
Because he starts by throwing an absolute grenade at how the West views yoga.
Oh, he really does.
I always thought of yoga and religion as completely separate lanes. Yoga is the physical stretching you do at a studio on Tuesday, and religion is the belief system you practice at a mosque or a church on Sunday.
Right, that's the standard cultural view.
But Osman says asking if yoga is better than religion is a fundamentally flawed question.
He essentially rejects the whole premise. And to understand why, we have to look at the foundational texts of these ancient sciences, specifically Patanjali's Raja Yoga.
Okay.
If you look at the fundamental pillars of this system, they're built on two core concepts, yama and niyama.
Let's define those mechanically. Like, what actually are they?
So they translate roughly to ethical restraints and observances. The yamas are things you consciously avoid doing so you don't harm yourself or society.
Like what?
Things like nonviolence, truthfulness, and not stealing. And then the niyamas are the active observances you cultivate, like purity, contentment, and intense self-discipline.
Wait, I'm looking at that list. And nonviolence, not stealing, practicing charity. I mean, that is literally the exact same moral bedrock of Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and Buddhism.
That is precisely Osman's point. The DNA is identical. In the ancient scientific framework, religion is not a separate lane from yoga. Religion is actually a subset of the broader yogic science.
I got to push back on that a little bit, though, because calling religion a subset of yoga almost sounds like, I don't know, Eastern imperialism.
How do you mean?
Well, it sounds like he's trying to claim ownership over Western theologies by saying, oh, you're just doing our thing.
Yeah, I see why it sounds that way. But he's not claiming historical ownership at all. He's categorizing human behavior based on internal mechanics.
Okay.
He introduces this concept of bhakti yoga. When we translate bhakti, it basically means devotion or supreme love.
Right.
So, the ancient framework says, if a human being has an unflinching belief in a higher power, if they engage in worship, if they surrender their ego to a divine concept within a religious community, that specific mechanical action of the human heart and mind is bhakti yoga.
I see.
You aren't doing an alternative to yoga. The act of pure religious devotion is the yoga itself.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. It's a categorization of psychological states.
Huh.
But if bhakti is for the deeply devoted, what about someone who is aggressively analytical?
Right, the skeptics.
Because Osman brings up another path that completely melted my brain. He talks about jnana yoga. And he points out that this path involves absolute zero meditation. No physical postures, no hatha yoga, no chanting. He explicitly says it completely ignores mystical concepts like kundalini energy.
And let's actually define kundalini quickly, just so we know what is being ignored here.
Good idea.
In mystical traditions, kundalini is described as this dormant, primal energy located at the base of the spine.
Right, the snake uncoiling, right.
Exactly, and the goal of many rigorous practices is to awaken this energy and move it up through the body's energy centers, or chakras, to achieve enlightenment.
Which sounds highly esoteric. It requires massive physical and energetic manipulation. And honestly, it just sounds exhausting. But jnana yoga just tosses all of that out the window.
Completely tosses it. And jnana yoga relies purely on philosophical speculation, intellect, and just relentless scientific analysis.
Walk me through the actual mechanics of that. How does sitting in an armchair reading philosophy equate to spiritual evolution? Because to me, reading a dense book just feels like homework.
It comes down to neuroplasticity and the dissolution of cognitive bias. In jnana yoga, you use the intellect as a scalpel to cut away everything that is false or illusory.
So you're just questioning everything.
Relentlessly, you ask, who am I? What is the nature of reality? Is this perception objectively true, or is my brain just filtering it?
Wow.
The mechanical action here is the sustained, intense cognitive load required to deconstruct your own ego and your own belief systems.
So by relentlessly demanding empirical truth, you eventually realize the limitations of your own mind.
Yes, exactly. You literally rewire the neural pathways associated with your distinct, separate sense of self. You realize you are just a biological observer.
That's fascinating.
Right. You can reach the highest levels of human evolution, the exact same peak states as the guy meditating for 12 hours, simply by being intensely devoted to philosophical truth and scientific inquiry.
That is wild. And he doesn't stop there. He mentions a third path, karma yoga, which he defines as the yoga of action or service.
And this is perhaps the most accessible one. It is the practice of selflessly contributing to others without any attachment to the reward.
He gives such basic examples, too, like contributing intellectually to a project, helping someone in poverty, or literally just offering a smile and being a quiet, attentive listener to a friend who is suffering. That is karma yoga.
Again, look at the internal mechanics. When you are deeply, genuinely listening to a friend in pain, what is happening to your ego?
It goes offline.
Exactly. It completely goes offline. You are entirely focused on alleviating the suffering of another. You've stepped out of your own self-centered survival loop.
Right.
That dissolution of the self is the core mechanism of all yoga, and you achieve it simply by being a good friend.
So think of yoga, then, not as a sweaty fitness class in a strip mall, but as a massive university.
I love this analogy.
Right, like hatha yoga, the physical stretching and breathing we obsess over in the West. That's just the physical education department.
Yeah.
It's necessary for the vehicle of the body, sure, but it's just one building. Bhakti is the theology department. Jnana is the philosophy and empirical science department. And karma is the school of social work.
And when you view the human experience through that structural lens, you realize that asking if the theology department is better than the physical education department is absurd.
It makes no sense.
They are entirely different tools designed for entirely different human temperaments.
But this brings up a massive friction point for me.
Okay, what is it?
Well, if science, intellect, and rigorous philosophical speculation can be their own valid path to truth, this Jnana Yoga we just talked about, how does Osman use that heavily intellectual framework to deal with the ultimate intellectual roadblock, the concept of God?
Yes. The friction you are pointing out is basically the crux of epistemology.
Which is what exactly?
Epistemology is the philosophical study of how we know what we know. How do we distinguish a justified empirical truth from just a very strongly held opinion?
Right. Because intellect relies on boundaries. To scientifically analyze something, you have to measure it, weigh it, or at least, conceptualize its edges.
Exactly.
But by definition, across almost all major theology, God is considered limitless, infinite.
And Osman, applying the rigorous logic of Jnana Yoga, points out that this creates an insurmountable cognitive barrier for human beings.
How so?
Well, for a human to genuinely know a piece of information, that information has to fit within our cognitive architecture. It has to be processed by our neurology and fit within the boundaries of our imagination.
I'm trying to picture this. It's almost like trying to render a four-dimensional object on a standard two-dimensional television screen.
That is a perfect analogy.
Right. The hardware of the television simply does not possess the capacity to display the true object.
Yeah.
It can only ever show a distorted, flattened shadow of it.
Our brains are those 2D screens. We are inherently limited biological entities. We have a distinct limit to our intelligence, a finite number of neurons, and a hard boundary on what we can imagine.
Right. We literally run out of processing power.
Exactly. Therefore, if a creator or a fundamental universal consciousness is truly infinite and limitless, it is functionally inconceivable to a limited mind.
You literally cannot contain the limitless within the limited. So it is fundamentally unknowable in an empirical scientific sense.
Unknowable. That is the key word. Osman makes a razor-sharp distinction here between knowledge and belief.
Okay.
Because absolute knowledge of the infinite is physically impossible for the human brain, everything we engage with in the spiritual realm boils down to belief.
I feel like a lot of deeply religious people would be incredibly offended by that, though. They would say, no, I have experienced revelation. I know God exists.
They would. And Osman would counter that they have experienced a profound psychological or physiological event, which their brain then interpreted through the lens of their specific culture.
Oh, wow.
But they do not possess absolute empirical knowledge of the infinite. What's remarkable is Osman's candor about his own stance here. He describes having what he calls a convicted belief.
A convicted belief.
Yeah, it is an unshakable, undeviated firmness in his faith.
But he admits it's still a belief.
Yes. That is the Jnana intellect at work. He feels his faith with every cell in his body, but he is intellectually honest enough to state that his intense conviction still does not equal empirical knowledge.
I have to say, that is a profound level of intellectual humility. He's essentially saying, I am betting my entire existence on this, but I am smart enough to admit I cannot mathematically prove it to you. Think about how that reframes the exhausting cultural debates we see every day between staunch theists and aggressive atheists.
It dismantles the entire conflict.
Completely. Because according to Osman's epistemological logic, neither side can claim the high ground of knowledge.
No.
The religious fundamentalist who claims to know for an absolute fact that God exists is trapped by the exact same cognitive limits as the atheist who claims to know for an absolute fact that God does not exist. You are both claiming to have measured the infinite.
You're both claiming the 2D screen is accurately displaying the 4D object.
Exactly.
When you realize that your deepest, most foundational worldview is ultimately a belief framework and not a provable fact, it annihilates religious arrogance. It forces a radical tolerance.
You, listener, just think about this in your own life. Reflect on the convictions you hold. It might not be religious. Maybe it's a political ideology, an economic theory, or just a harsh judgment you have about how other people should live.
Yeah.
Do you hold those beliefs so tightly that you've tricked your own brain into thinking they're absolute knowledge?
It's a very humbling audit to perform on your own mind. But, Osman anticipates the immediate cynical pushback here.
Which is?
Well, if it is all just belief, if the ultimate truth is permanently locked behind an epistemological wall, why even bother? Why practice religion? Why pray? Why participate in any of this if we can't ever know for sure?
And this is where the deep dive takes a massive turn, because Osman drops the philosophy and brings in the hard data. He turns to large-scale epidemiological research to defend the sheer biological utility of faith.
And we really need to understand the scale of what epidemiology looks at. We are not talking about a psychologist study done on 30 college students in a lab.
Right. It's not a small sample size.
Not at all. Epidemiological research tracks hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions of human beings spanning decades across entirely different continents and socioeconomic backgrounds. It is the gold standard for tracking human health outcomes.
Which means we can't brush this off as a placebo effect. The sample size is just too massive.
The data Osman highlights is unequivocal. The epidemiological conclusion is that people who hold a strong conviction in a belief system, specifically a communal religious one, exhibit a dramatic reduction in their baseline stress levels.
Okay.
And more importantly, they show a 20% to 30% stronger ability to repel or avoid contracting chronic physical conditions.
Okay,
Yeah.
I need to stop you there. A 20 to 30% reduction in chronic physical disease simply by having a thought in your head.
Yep.
How does an abstract belief in a higher power create a literal biological shield against a virus or a feeling organ? Walk me through the mechanics of that, because honestly, it sounds like magic.
It sounds like it, but it's not magic. It is the deeply established field of psychoneuroimmunology.
That is a big word.
It is. But it comes down to the catastrophic impact of stress on human physiology. When a human being feels unsafe, isolated, or existentially threatened by the chaos of life, the brain activates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, the HPA axis.
The fight or flight response.
Exactly. The body floods with cortisol and adrenaline. Now, if you are running from a predator, that is great. You need that.
Sure.
But in modern life, we are constantly bathed in low-grade existential stress, and chronic cortisol exposure is devastating. It suppresses the immune system's ability to produce white blood cells.
Wow.
It shortens the telomeres on your DNA, which literally accelerates cellular aging. It massively increases systemic inflammation, which is the foundational breeding ground for autoimmune diseases, cardiovascular failure, and, as Osman points out, cancer.
So how does the belief system intervene in all that?
By providing a psychological buffer. Religion provides an anchor of meaning. It tells the brain, you are not alone in a chaotic, meaningless void. You are part of a grand design. You have a community that will catch you if you fall, and your suffering has a purpose.
Right.
When the brain genuinely believes that, the threat detection system stands down. The HPA axis turns off. Cortisol levels plummet.
So the belief isn't fighting the disease directly. The belief is turning off the stress valve, which allows the body's natural immune system to turn back on and do its job.
Precisely. And this loops perfectly back to Osman's claim about his bioenergy healing having a 90% success rate.
Right.
He says the healing isn't some supernatural intervention. It is just a restoration of the natural energy and immunity that modern stress-drenched lifestyles have depleted. The religious conviction is acting as a prophylactic against the stress that causes the depletion in the first place.
I do have to play devil's advocate here, though.
Yeah.
What about the people for whom religion is the actual cause of their stress?
Oh, sure.
Think about toxic religious communities, the fear of eternal damnation, the guilt, the ostracization if you break a rule. Surely, the data has to account for the fact that theology can be weaponized to spike your cortisol.
That is a highly valid point. The data doesn't suggest that all religious environments are healthy. Toxic environments will absolutely trigger the HPA axis. But the epidemiological benefit is found in the conviction of the belief and the support of the community, not necessarily the specific dogma. When the belief system fosters surrender, peace, and belonging, the biological shield activates.
I just love the irony of this entire segment. Osman is using Jnana Yoga pure scientific analysis, epidemiology, and biology to scientifically validate the physiological necessity of Bhakti Yoga pure devotional faith.
Yeah.
He is using the science department to prove that the theology department is actually keeping the students from getting sick.
It's brilliant. It grounds the ethereal concept of faith in tangible biology. Even if you completely reject the existence of the infinite, the practice of a stabilizing belief system is undeniably valuable for your physical survival.
Which brings up a direct challenge for you listening right now. If you lean heavily into atheism, or you pride yourself on pure, cold rationality, What is your anchor?
Exactly.
What is the community or the philosophy that is actively turning off your HPA axis and lowering your baseline cortisol? Because the hard science says you absolutely need one.
But Osman pushes us even further. Science proves the baseline physiological benefits, the 30% immune boost. But what about the peak?
The enlightenment part.
Right. What about the ultimate mystical experiences? Can you reach those hyper-elevated states of human consciousness sitting in a standard church pew, or do you actually need to isolate yourself on a mountain?
This leads us to the most stunning personal anecdote from the source material. We establish that Osman is a master. He has practiced the most intense protocols for 50 years.
Yes.
He has achieved samadhi, the absolute pinnacle of yogic enlightenment, about 5 times in his entire life. But here's the kicker. He reveals that the majority of those times, the most profound, reality-altering experiences he ever had, did not happen during silent, isolated meditation.
They happen during a standard religious prayer service in a church.
He describes the scene so vividly. He isn't sitting in a lotus position trying to force his energy up his spine. He's just standing in a congregation, and they are singing hymns praising God.
Right.
He says it wasn't his own voice that did it. It was the collective. This immense wave of hundreds of human voices merged together, creating a wall of sound of collective energy that simply swept him away.
Let's break down what is actually happening in the brain during an event like this, because it's fascinating. He describes collapsing, going completely unconscious in a state of absolute bliss.
Yeah.
When he came to, minutes later, though he notes some people remain in this state for days, he was so overwhelmed he physically could not speak.
What is the neurology of that? How does singing a song bypass decades of meditation?
It has to do with the vagus nerve and the default mode network in the brain. The vagus nerve runs from the brainstem down through the vocal cords and into the heart and gut.
Okay.
When you sing, especially in a sustained rhythmic way like a hymn, you are physically vibrating and stimulating that vagus nerve. This radically shifts the nervous system into a parasympathetic rest and digest state.
So the physical act of singing is literally hacking the nervous system into deep relaxation.
Yes. But then you add the collective element. When human beings sing together, their heart rates actually synchronize.
Really?
Yes. This creates a massive state of psychological safety. As this happens, the default mode network, the part of the brain responsible for your ego, your sense of a separate self, your anxieties about the past and future, begins to shut down.
The boundaries of the teacup dissolve.
Precisely. You experience what sociologists call collective effervescence. The boundary between me and everyone else vanishes.
Wow.
For Osman, whose brain was already highly trained by 50 years of yoga, this massive vagal stimulation and DMN shutdown acted as a catalyst. It triggered a spontaneous samadhi.
Now compare that to the alternative he mentions. He talks about the deathless body. What exactly is that?
The deathless body is a theoretical peak state in ancient yogic texts. It proposes a state of absolute cellular suspension, where the practitioner essentially stops the aging process by completely mastering their metabolic rate through intense concentration and breath control.
And what does it take to even attempt that?
Osman states it requires a minimum of 8 to 12 hours of the most grueling, rigorous meditations every single day.
And here is the profound contrast. Osman points out that you could subject yourself to that 12-hour-a-day torture for your entire life, and there is absolute zero guarantee you will ever experience enlightenment.
Right.
Yet he achieved it by letting a choir sing to him.
He also brings up indigenous traditions to prove how varied the triggers can be. He references cultures where individuals act as spiritual conduits for their communities.
Well, like shamans.
Exactly. They reach incredibly deep, trance-like states simply by smoking a pipe in a ceremonial setting. In that altered state, they access intuitive, high-level problem-solving capacities to help their society. And they do this without any formal yogic stretching, without reading Patanjali, and without a 12-hour meditation protocol.
It completely democratizes spiritual peaks. It proves that the setting, the church, the cave, the tribal circle, and specific method, singing, fasting, smoking a pipe matter far less than the internal mechanism.
Right.
And what is that mechanism? It's surrender.
That is the crucial insight. In the intense 12-hour meditation, the ego is still heavily involved. You are trying to get enlightened. You are forcing the breath.
Efforting.
Right. But in the church, Osman wasn't trying to do anything. He surrendered his intellectual, analyzing mind to the wave of the collective.
He let go. I think his decades of discipline built the neurological infrastructure, sure. But the spark was surrender, which tells us There is no minor league in spirituality.
No, there isn't.
Going to a church service, if done with deep surrender and community connection, has the exact same biological and spiritual potential as the most elite ashram in the Himalayas.
But this naturally leads us to a very sobering reality check.
Yeah.
If achieving a 30% reduction in chronic disease or even reaching a state of blissful spiritual connection is accessible through simple practices like volunteering, community singing, or a 5-minute breathwork routine, why is the modern world so incredibly sick and stressed out?
Osman addresses this with the statistic that honestly stopped me in my tracks. Drawing from his decades of teaching, he states that 99.99% of people are simply not interested in, or are completely incapable of, practicing any form of deep psychological evolution or formal yoga.
99.99%. That leaves 1 in 10,000 people who actually engage with this material.
My initial reaction to that was, wow, that sounds incredibly arrogant. It sounds like he is saying the vast majority of humanity is just intellectually or spiritually deficient.
It does sound that way initially, but when you look at his reasoning, it is actually rooted in deep compassion and sociology. He clarifies that this lack of engagement has nothing to do with people being inherently lesser. It is entirely a matter of sheer biological and economic survival.
He paints a brutal picture of modern existence. He talks about the rising epidemic of anxiety, depression, unhealed PTSD, and the constant hum of financial and social stress.
Let's look at the mechanics of a brain under that kind of pressure. When a human being is completely consumed by stressful life circumstances, like if they are facing eviction, battling a chronic illness, or living in a physically dangerous environment, their mental bandwidth is entirely hijacked by the amygdala.
Okay.
The brain is locked in a perpetual threat detection loop just to keep the organism alive until tomorrow.
In that state of pure survival mode, Osman says an individual literally lacks the free time and space to think of aesthetic things.
I love that phrasing. Aesthetic thing.
It maps perfectly onto Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Walk the listener through that structure quickly.
So Maslow proposed a pyramid of human needs.
Mm.
At the foundational bottom layer, you have absolute physiological necessities: food, water, sleep, shelter.
Right.
The layer directly above that is safety, personal security, employment, physical health.
And the top of the pyramid.
The very peak is self-actualization.
Mm.
This is where spiritual evolution, philosophical inquiry, and enlightenment sit. So the logic is brutal but undeniable. You cannot demand that a human being focus on the peak of the pyramid when the foundation is crumbling.
You literally can't.
If you don't know how you're going to feed your kids on Tuesday, you literally do not have the neurological luxury to sit on a cushion and ponder the infinite nature of the universe.
Exactly. The evolution of consciousness is a luxury of peace. Osman recognizes that 99.99% of the global population is currently dealing with a foundation that is on fire. They are bailing water out of a sinking boat. You don't try to teach someone a breathing exercise while they're actively drowning.
Which leads to a really profound, almost uncomfortable realization about privilege. I struggle with this because it essentially implies that spiritual enlightenment is locked behind a socioeconomic paywall. Does Osman believe that only the wealthy get to evolve?
He doesn't frame it strictly around wealth, but around the privilege of peace.
For a privilege of peace.
Yeah. He explicitly states that anyone who has the time, the inclination, and the mental bandwidth to even think about the concepts we are discussing today is incredibly privileged. He calls the people who have the space for this path diamonds among rocks.
He says they are 1 in a million, possessing a higher level of psychological evolution at this specific moment in time. But again, it's not intrinsic superiority, it is circumstantial privilege.
And with that privilege comes a profound responsibility. If your circumstances have afforded you the peace required to step out of pure survival mode, what are you doing with that bandwidth? Are you squandering it on trivial distractions, or are you actively using it to evolve?
If you are listening to this right now, if you have carved out an hour of your day to listen to a deep dive on epistemology, neuroplasticity, and ancient yogic science, Osman is looking directly at you.
Right.
You have the privilege of peace. You have the mental space to engage with these empirically proven tools. Are you using them? Are you practicing the karma yoga of helping those whose foundations are still on fire?
It's a real call to action. I mean, look at what we've covered today. We have dismantled the false dichotomy between religion and yoga. We've seen that they are just different tools in the same university.
We explored how bhakti, the yoga of pure devotion, is a scientifically verified mechanism to drop your cortisol and shield your body from chronic disease by up to 30%.
We analyzed how jnana, the yoga of relentless intellect, forces us to humbly accept the biological limits of our own brains when facing the infinite, which destroys religious arrogance in the process.
We broke down the neurology of how singing in a choir can stimulate the vagus nerve and dissolve the default mode network, triggering a state of absolute enlightenment that bypasses decades of grueling meditation.
The synthesis of all this data is that there is absolutely no deficiency in whatever path you find yourself on. Whether you are deeply devoted to a communal religion, fiercely dedicated to empirical science and philosophical truth, or committed to quiet acts of service in your community, they are all valid, biologically sound mechanisms designed to elevate the human condition.
You don't need to force yourself into a spiritual aesthetic that doesn't fit your neurological temperament.
Right.
If you have the rare privilege of mental bandwidth, your only job is to pick the path that resonates with you and walk it.
Exactly.
But I want to leave you with a final lingering thought to ponder as you go back to your day. We started this deep dive by shattering the image of the isolated yogi, replacing it with Osman finding profound, life-altering bliss simply by letting the collective voices of a church wash over him.
Yeah.
I want you to look closely at your own daily routine. What completely mundane, ordinary activity, whether it's singing loudly in your car, deeply listening to a friend, or just fully surrendering to a moment of shared community. What if that totally ordinary moment is actually your hidden backdoor path to the highest state of human consciousness?